Welcome, my name is Dr. Vicky Nugg and I am a lecturer in criminology here at UTAS. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction into therapeutic jurisprudence, what it is, and also give you an example of a way in which therapeutic jurisprudence is operating here in Tasmania today. Excuse me while I look away and get my slides happening. Before I jump into it and really get down into, what therapeutic jurisprudence is, it's really important for us to know what jurisprudence in general is. And hopefully by this point, you've had a chance to hear some of the other presentations as part of Lawfest. And so some of this information might not be, new to you, but I thought it might be good to cover off again just before we go into what is different about therapeutic jurisprudence as opposed to the more traditional ways in which the courts generally operate. To begin with, let's look at the purposes of sentencing. A magistrate or a judge, when they're sentencing someone who's been found guilty of an offence, will generally have 5 main purposes in mind as to what they're trying to achieve by sentencing the person. So in the first instance, they'll be looking at deterrence, both specific and general as well. Specific deterrence is about deterring the individual who has been found guilty of the offence. And general deterrence is trying to deter the rest of the population. So members of the public will know that, if they commit a crime, then this will be the outcome, that this may be a penalty that they get. That it is also denounced by the court, and denunciation is obviously the second purpose that's there on the slide as well. Rehabilitation is another purpose of sentencing. A lot of times people talk about rehabilitation as being the reason why people are sent to jail. A lot of members of the public think that rehabilitation only happens in prisons, and prisons are the best place for the rehabilitation to take place. And it's not to say that judges and magistrates necessarily agree with that prisons are where rehabilitation should happen, but they may think about how the offender could be or should be rehabilitated before they are, released back into the community, or whether some community form of sentencing might be a better option for the rehabilitation prospects of the offender. Just punishment is also another purpose of sentencing. So just punishment is making sure that you don't punish someone too excessively or too leniently, but you find the balance that's there to ensure that the victim, the community, the offender, and the court are all in agreement that this is the ideal, or not necessarily ideal, but the just punishment for the individual for the crime that they've committed. And the last purpose of sentencing is community protection. And that's probably the one that most people think about the most, is that they want to ensure that the community is safe. And that's understandable. It's really important for people to feel safe in their streets, in their schools, in their homes. And it's understandable that that's something that magistrates and judges will have to keep in mind to make sure that, when they're sentencing someone, they're balancing all of these 5 issues appropriately, and the community in a way has a say as well, and what the community needs is part of that too. So because of this, a lot of the times people think that what judges and magistrates need to do is put everyone who has committed a crime into prison. Unfortunately, as you may be aware, prisons don't tend to work. So the way in which we measure whether a punishment works or not is looking at recidivism. Recidivism tends to be the main way that, as criminologists, we look at whether a certain form of punishment or whether a certain program is working or not. So in 2019, the Australian Productivity Commission report stated that 46.3% of Tasmanian prisoners ended back up in prison within 2 years of their release. So that is almost 50% of prisoners who were released between 2017 and 2018 found their way back into the prison, basically in a 2-year period. 55.5% of prisoners end up returning to corrective services. So that's not necessarily prison, but also a community order within 2 years. And that's taken from the Sentencing Advisory Council in Victoria, and that's a 2019 number as well. So not just prisons, but also other forms or other ways in which people are, touching the criminal justice system is much higher than obviously just the ones who go back to prison. But that demonstrates that over 50% of people who have gone to prison will end up, falling foul of the criminal justice system in one way or another. This has grown. So this is actually an issue that we have here in Australia and in many parts of the Western world as well, is that imprisonment rates are growing and the recidivism rates as well are growing. And this is one of the reasons why we tend to say in criminology and in law as well that prisons are demonstrating that they don't work, that there's a lot of issues with the way they're being run, there's a lot of issues with what we're focusing on. So when we're looking at the purposes of sentencing, a lot of the times the magistrates or the judges might be focusing on community protection, and the community wants to feel protected, so they say, could you send more people to prison? And that is what policy makers as well will focus on, is that fear that people have of crime, rather than focusing on other things such as rehabilitation, for instance, or just punishment. So what we're seeing is an increase in the number of people ending up in prison. And Tasmania is not in an enviable position. So we here are third for recidivism in the country, behind the Northern Territory and New South Wales as well. And so Tasmania's got a very small population, pretty similar to the Northern Territory. So it's actually something that is not good that the top three of the highest rates of recidivism in Australia are taking place in at least two places where there is actually quite a small population in place. Overall in Australia, so previously we were talking about Victoria, but overall in Australia, 54.2% of released prisoners return to corrective services within 2 years. I don't know about other people, and you may have a very different opinion, and that's perfectly all right. But if for instance, you were taking a legal studies class and 54% of people who took that class failed, you'd probably be asking some questions about your teachers, you'd be asking some questions about the content, you'd be wondering why 54% of people are failing. And it's the same sort of thing that you need to think about when it comes to prisons as well. If prisons worked, then how come 54% of people are failing? Because getting back into the prison system is in a way showing that it's not working, that the prison system is tripping people up. So, and that includes prison as well as community orders, but the bulk of that will be people who are returning back into prison or returning, in contact with the criminal justice system again. So pretty stark numbers, and numbers that are not good to see. So can we do things differently? And the answer is yes, we can. And that's therapeutic jurisprudence. So what therapeutic jurisprudence is the idea, the idea is perhaps, the easiest way to put it. The way that people who are proponents of therapeutic jurisprudence look at the criminal justice system as having three ways in which it can affect individuals. That is, it can impede people, promote goodness, or be neutral. So this is not just offenders, but also victims, and it is thinking more broadly about what is justice. So if one of the things that we're trying to ensure with the justice system is that it is just and fair, then in that instance, we need to make sure that the way that the criminal justice system operates isn't detrimental to everyone. It isn't detrimental to offenders and to victims and the community, and preventing justice from prevailing. So to impede means obviously to have a negative outcome. So that can include mentally and emotionally, as well as physically, on someone who's participating with the criminal justice system. So not just offenders, it can also be victims. promotion or promoting can lead to positive outcomes. So mentally and emotionally and physically making someone feel better or feel good as part of the process. And neutral is that it doesn't impact someone positively or negatively. So that can actually be quite bad, because it can mean that someone might not be deterred from committing any more crimes. And so you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, with the outcomes to such an extent that it has an impact on their mental well-being, their emotional well-being, their psychology, and their physical well-being as well. So it can be very traumatic, both for victims and for offenders, to go through the processes of the criminal justice system. And therapeutic jurisprudence is not trying to have negative outcomes, and it's not trying to have just neutral outcomes. It's really trying to promote justice, but also promote what can work the best for offenders, to rehabilitate, to ensure for the victims that there's reparation, so that they feel that their needs have been listened to, that they have been compensated, for instance, whether it's financially or whether it's through receiving, an apology from the person who has committed a crime against them. And one way in which therapeutic jurisprudence works is through community-based orders. So that can be an alternative to imprisonment that magistrates or judges can sentence someone to. And in Tassie, that's under the Sentencing Act of 1997 and the Corrections Act of 1997 as well. And as part of that, the community corrections orders combine supervision and community service. So that can be the community service orders. But there can also be parole orders, drug treatment orders, and home detention orders as well. So these are other ways in which someone can receive punishment that doesn't involve sending the person to prison. And you're probably wondering, well, is it fair and is it just? And the answer is, if you look at the research, and as a criminologist, and I'm a very big proponent of looking at the research evidence, what we actually see coming out of the research is that these forms of orders, or these forms of orders, these orders, are actually much more beneficial to outcomes both for offenders and for victims as well. So they are promoting goodness of life, goodness of justice in individuals. The one we're going to look at is drug treatment orders. So we're just going to have a quick squiz at what that looks like, and especially what that looks like here in Tasmania. So in Tasmania, we call them the Court Mandated Diversion, or the CMD program, otherwise known as the drug court. And the aim of it is to break the drug crime cycle, and it uses the authority of the court to ensure that offenders access services and treatment. So because of that, it's a problem-solving and a therapeutic approach, and falls under the umbrella of therapeutic jurisprudence. Sometimes people look at this and go, well, this must be the soft option because the person doesn't go to prison. And the answer is no, it's not the soft option. Oftentimes this is far more difficult, because if you go to prison, you are in effect put into a cell or put into a block with other prisoners, and you're left there until it's time for you to come out. And there might be some treatment orders that are put into place, but not necessarily. And in places like Tasmania, for instance, if you have a drug problem, there isn't really any rehabilitation available within the prison. So there was an alcohol and drug treatment component of the prison, but due to COVID-19, for instance, that's been shut down. And even before COVID, it could only treat 12 prisoners at any given time. And when you've got over 600 prisoners, that's clearly not enough. So the drug court, in a way, takes some of the pressure off the prison system, but it also focuses on ensuring that the court works with the offender to try and break their offending, trying to understand why the individual has offended in the first place, putting them in touch with the relevant NGOs, for instance, to receive the treatment that they need. Now, there is a caveat to all of this. This is the drug court. Unfortunately, in Tasmania, it doesn't deal with any alcohol issues. So if the individual has an alcohol and a drug addiction, unfortunately, they cannot go through this program, which is a problem. In most other jurisdictions, alcohol and drug courts go together, but here in Tasmania, it's just the drug court at the moment. Hopefully, down the track, we can get the alcohol component added to it as well, because oftentimes people who have a drug problem have an alcohol problem as well that needs treatment. The way that the CMD works is it works through 3 phases. The first phase is stabilization, and what that requires is honesty from the offender, honesty from the magistrate, honesty from the community corrections workers, the case managers, and any other individuals who are, for instance, working with the offender or are the offender's family and friends as well. It is about building rapport between all the people who are working as part of this system. So this is it runs through the magistrates here in Tasmania. So it won't include, or it can include judges, but it tends to be magistrates who are running the show when it comes to the CMD. And because of that, it requires the magistrates who are part of this process to build a rapport with the offender, which is very different to the way that courts will tend to operate, where the judge sort of sits further away from the offender and sits above them as well, while the offender is sitting down and further away from the bench. So here it's about building that relationship and connection, and it's about ensuring compliance. So making sure that the person stops using drugs. They have a variety of service options that the magistrate may put them in touch with to get case management, to get alcohol and drug counselling, group or individual, and it's called AOD counselling, but it is, as I was saying, the focus is on the drug component. It can also include CBT programs, detox, pharmacotherapy as well. So if there is some other prescription drug that can be used to help the individual, education and employment support is part of the service options here, and other forms of counselling such as anger management, family violence, parenting support, gambling, or grief counselling if grief may be one of the underlying reasons why someone has gone down the path of drug taking that has then impacted on the crime that they've committed. Following phase 1, you have phase 2, which is consolidation. So that's identifying education and employment opportunities, modelling pro-social behaviour in the offender. So that means that the magistrate, for instance, is also modelling the behaviour that they expect to see in the offender, and likewise case managers and also other family and friends are expected to be pro-social models for the offender around them. And it is about maintaining abstinence from drugs. So the way that would be tested, for instance, is through urinalysis. And sometimes regular ones at a specific time, but also ones that may be just, off the cuff. Someone decides to send someone out to the offender's home and ask them to complete a urinalysis test. Phase 3 is reintegration. So that's to try and prevent relapse, to try and prevent the person from getting back onto drugs. Engagement with employment and education services. So continuing that, ensuring that if the person is receiving training or has started a job or something like that, that continues. And then sustainability, making sure that the person, can lead a life that is sustainable for them and maintain that abstinence that they've started. So bringing it back to what you're probably the most interested in out of all of this is, how does the court then work? So the court reviews are usually fortnightly. So again, a little bit different. So generally speaking, you have the court case, you might have the committal hearing, then you have the case, the trial that goes underway. once there's a finding of guilt, then there might be a sentencing as well that is separate to the trial. This all takes time, but you're not going to be spending, your time on a fortnightly basis going to the court necessarily. So here it is, you're expected to turn up and you're expected to sit and talk with your case manager and with the magistrate fortnightly or monthly once you get to phases 2 and 3. Generally speaking, there's a pre-court conference, so that's closed court, and that's the prosecutor, the defence, magistrate and the court diversion officer sit down and discuss any relevant matters without the participant being present. So that's making sure that, if they've failed a urinalysis, if they haven't gone to any appointments that they should be going to, then that's a chance for the various actors within the criminal justice system to meet and talk about what the next steps might be. Most magistrates conduct the pre-court conference from the bar table and remain sitting at the bar table. So they don't sit at the bench, they don't sit far away, they will sit at the same level and oftentimes just on the other side of the table from whoever is participating in the CMD. The roundtable process is therapeutic. So this is where it becomes, where we talk about therapeutic jurisprudence. It's part of the different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but it's also about the way the court operates. It operates very differently. It's a lot more collaborative. It's non-adversarial. So even though the prosecution's there and even though the defense is there, they're not trying to win the case. The prosecution's there because they actually want to see the person succeed and get through their CMD time without failing. And most magistrates will also require participants to complete a journal and to bring that journal with them and talk through what problems they may be having. So as you can see, this is very different to the traditional ways in which courts work. Now, when I was saying this is not the soft option, you can probably imagine this would be very difficult for a lot of people. For a lot of people who have drug addictions, for people who may have a history of, anxieties or mental illnesses or, just even a history of abuse or a long history of offending, this may be a lot more difficult for them and the most difficult thing that they've done when it comes to going to court. So it isn't the soft option. People think, they're just sitting around a table having a bit of a chat. It's a lot more intense than that, and it is focusing on ensuring that the person gets the help that they need to, wean themselves off drugs and be abstinent from drugs. It's not to say that if someone, at one point urinalysis shows that they, for instance, were using marijuana or were using another hard drug, that they immediately go back to prison. It's not how it works. So if someone, for instance, fails a urinalysis test, the magistrate may say that they give them, a day or two in prison. They don't actually need to go to prison until they accumulate 10 days. So this isn't just, sitting around and people holding hands and braiding each other's hair and having a chat. There is the stick that's there. The carrot is, this is 2 years and you are in the community, you're with your friends, you're with your family. If you're employed, you can continue your employment so long as you turn up to the courts. You're not going to prison, you're not being pulled out of your community and without those relationships that are important to rehabilitation. But the stick is still there. If you keep failing tests, if you're not going to appointments, if you're not journaling as the magistrate would like you to, be writing down on what's happening, then you can accumulate days in prison. And sometimes people will, go to prison after 10 days and they can pull out of the CMD. So they might go to prison and go, you know what? This is actually easier for me than going through the CMD, so I will serve the rest of my sentence here in prison. And in that case, it reverts to what the sentence would have been if you weren't going through the CMD process. So therapeutic jurisprudence works alongside traditional court processes, but as you can see, it's a little bit different. And we have a fantastic CMD court here in Tasmania. It doesn't have a lot of people going through it at the moment, unfortunately, because it requires more funding. So it's about 125 people per year, but it is a fantastic start. So hopefully this has given you a bit of an introduction into what therapeutic jurisprudence is. If you've got any questions, then feel free to ask. I will be around on the 2nd of September, I believe it is, and you can ask me about therapeutic jurisprudence or the CMD, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your time.